When most people think of ancient Egypt, images of towering pyramids, golden treasures, and graceful queens like Cleopatra or Nefertiti instantly come to mind. But behind the dazzling splendor of pharaohs and temples lay a world of rituals that to modern eyes can feel dark, eerie, and unsettling. Yet to the Egyptians themselves, these were sacred practices tied deeply to survival, kingship, and the afterlife. To understand these rituals, we must first step into the mindset of a civilization that viewed life and death as two sides of the same eternal journey, where every action carried cosmic weight, and where pleasing the gods was not just a matter of faith but of national survival. Egypt's world revolved around maintaining Ma'at, the divine order of balance and truth, and any disruption to this order was believed to unleash chaos upon the land, from failed harvests to plagues and foreign invasions. This belief created a climate in which rituals, no matter how grim or strange they may seem today, were seen as vital tools to keep the universe intact. One of the earliest and most misunderstood practices was ritual sacrifice, not of large numbers of people, as sensationalized by movies or myths, but targeted acts believed to appease angry gods or to serve as offerings in foundation ceremonies when temples or tombs were built. Archaeologists have found traces of servants buried alongside kings in Egypt's first dynasty, leading some scholars to argue that human sacrifice may have been practiced at the dawn of Egyptian civilization before eventually being replaced by symbolic substitutes like figurines known as shabtis. To the Egyptians, this was not cruelty but devotion, ensuring that the pharaoh was surrounded by attendants in the next world. Another shadowy aspect was the role of magic, or Heka, which Egyptians considered a divine force woven into the fabric of creation. Priests and magicians performed elaborate spells, some of which demanded unsettling ingredients, from animal parts to blood, to ward off evil or curse enemies. Such rites were not fringe practices but central to daily life, and official temple rituals often blended prayers with magical incantations, blurring the line between religion and sorcery. Then there were the rituals surrounding death, particularly mummification, which to outsiders can appear macabre. Yet to Egyptians, it was the highest expression of love and respect, ensuring that the body was preserved as a vessel for the soul. The removal of organs, the use of natron to dry the flesh, and the wrapping of the corpse in layers of linen were not gruesome acts but sacred steps meant to prepare a person for eternity. However, rumors from ancient sources like Herodotus described more secretive aspects of embalming, including accusations of priests violating corpses or using terrifying chants during the process, stories that may be more myth than reality but reflect the aura of mystery surrounding these practices. Among the darkest tales were rituals linked to power and kingship, such as the so-called smashing of enemies, a symbolic ceremony where effigies of Egypt's foes were destroyed in temple courtyards, sometimes accompanied by executions of real prisoners to demonstrate the pharaoh's dominion. These acts reinforce the image of the king as protector of Egypt, capable of crushing chaos with divine backing. To the Egyptian audience of the time, this was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but a reaffirmation of order in a dangerous world where survival depended on strength and ritual precision. Even fertility rites, which could involve shocking imagery or acts, were believed to ensure the Nile would flood on time and crops would flourish, tying human behavior directly to cosmic cycles. In retelling these stories, it's essential to separate sensational myths from archaeological evidence, because while ancient writers and modern media often exaggerate the brutality of Egyptian rituals, the reality is that most practices were deeply spiritual, symbolic, and carried out with belief that they maintained the harmony of the world. This is where the fascination lies, in exploring how rituals that might seem dark or terrifying to us today were, for the Egyptians, sources of comfort, order, and connection to the divine. As we move deeper into the hidden world of ancient Egyptian rituals, it becomes clear that many practices which strike modern audiences as dark or even disturbing were in fact seen as essential acts of devotion, rooted in a world where life was inseparable from death and humanity existed in constant dialogue with the gods. Among the most fascinating examples are the fertility rituals tied to the annual flooding of the Nile. To the Egyptians, the river was the very lifeblood of civilization, and its rise and fall determined whether their crops would thrive or wither. This gave birth to ceremonies designed to honor the gods associated with fertility, like Osiris and Hathor. Some ancient accounts speak of processions carrying sacred images through the fields, sometimes involving symbolic acts of sexuality that to us might appear shocking, but were considered prayers embodied in action, urging the gods to bless the soil with abundance. These rituals were not performed in secret, but often in public festivals, demonstrating the open acknowledgement of fertility as a divine gift. Beyond agriculture, fertility was also central to family life, and households practiced smaller-scale rituals to encourage conception, using amulets, charms, and incantations that invoked the powers of Hathor or Bes, a dwarf god believed to protect women in childbirth. Modern archaeologists have found fertility figurines, some explicitly sexual in form, buried in homes and shrines, showing that these practices were woven into daily existence, not just temple ceremonies. Yet, the perception of darkness arises when one considers how such acts could blend into more severe rites, such as blood offerings or animal sacrifices designed to bind the gods to humanity's pleas. In temples dedicated to Sekhmet, the fierce lion-headed goddess of war and plague, priests performed rituals that sometimes involved the symbolic slaughter of animals, perhaps to appease her destructive energy and redirect it toward protecting Egypt instead of punishing it. This mixture of reverence and fear is a recurring theme in Egyptian religion. Deities were not seen as purely benevolent, but as powerful forces whose favor had to be carefully maintained. Another layer of ritual that appears unsettling to modern viewers was protective magic. Egyptians deeply feared invisible enemies such as demons, curses, or the wandering dead, and they turned to spells inscribed on papyri, carved into amulets, or whispered during night rituals to shield themselves. Some of these spells demanded ingredients like hair, fingernails, or even blood, creating an image of sorcery that easily translates into dark ritual in the modern imagination. In truth, these practices reflected an intense desire for safety in a world where disease, invasion, and disaster were constant threats. Protective magic extended even to the battlefield, where pharaohs carried charms and priests performed incantations over soldiers, believing that words and symbols could tip the balance of war as surely as weapons. Perhaps most dramatic were the cursing rituals aimed at enemies. Archaeologists have discovered clay figurines with names of foreign rulers or rebels inscribed on them, bound and smashed in ceremonies known as execration rituals. To Egyptians, destroying these figures symbolically weakened the real enemies by severing their connection to divine protection. While to us this may sound like primitive voodoo, in their eyes it was a sophisticated act of psychological and spiritual warfare, ensuring victory before the first arrow was even shot. What makes these rituals so compelling to study today is not only their strangeness, but the way they blur the boundaries between religion, politics, and daily life, showing that for Egyptians, every ritual act was both a personal prayer and a political tool. The pharaoh, priests, and ordinary citizens were united by the belief that ritual behavior could shape reality itself. And though some of these practices seem eerie, fertility ceremonies tinged with sexuality, protective spells calling for odd substances, curses designed to harm. They reflect the Egyptians' remarkable determination to control their fate in a world where so much felt uncertain. By peeling back the myths and exaggerations, we begin to see a society that embraced ritual not as sinister obsession, but as a lifeline, a means of negotiating with gods whose moods could mean life or death for the land of the Nile. If there is one area of ancient Egyptian culture that has fueled the greatest fascination and fear in the modern imagination, it is the realm of death rituals and the journey into the afterlife, where myths and reality intertwine to create practices that many consider among Egypt's darkest. Death was not the end for Egyptians. It was a transformation, a passage to another world where the soul, or Ka, lived eternally, provided the proper rituals were performed. This belief made funerary customs the centerpiece of religious life, and the sheer effort devoted to them is staggering. Tombs were not just graves but cosmic gateways, decorated with spells from the Book of the Dead, a collection of incantations meant to guide the soul through perilous realms of demons, gates, and trials overseen by gods. One of the most unsettling aspects, from our perspective, was the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual performed on the deceased to restore their senses in the afterlife. Priests touched special instruments to the lips, eyes, and ears of the mummy, chanting prayers to awaken its ability to eat, speak, and see again. To an ancient Egyptian family, this was an act of love and spiritual duty. But for a modern viewer, the image of priests touching the stiffened face of a corpse in a dimly lit tomb may evoke chills. The process of mummification itself added to this aura of mystery and dread. Organs were removed, the brain sometimes extracted through the nose, and the body packed with natron to dry it before being wrapped in layers of linen. Herodotus, the Greek historian, describes these processes with both awe and revulsion. And while his accounts may exaggerate some elements, archaeological evidence confirms the care and skill involved. For Egyptians, these actions preserved the sacred vessel of the soul. For outsiders, they became symbols of Egypt's strange and morbid devotion to death. Accompanying the embalming were magical rituals meant to protect the deceased from spiritual dangers. Amulets like the Eye of Horus or scarabs were tucked between linen layers, each with incantations of protection, while priests recited spells to ward off threats in the underworld. These practices show how tightly magic, religion, and ritual blended, creating a comprehensive system where nothing was left to chance. Even food offerings placed in tombs were ritualized, often accompanied by symbolic slaughter of animals, which might seem brutal today but were thought to nourish the dead in eternity. Perhaps the darkest imagery comes from the mythic journey through the underworld, where the deceased faced terrifying monsters, rivers of fire, and the final judgment before Osiris. The famous weighing of the heart ritual, where the soul's heart was balanced against the feather of Maat, remains one of history's most haunting images. If the heart was heavy with sin, it was devoured by Ammit, a monstrous being part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, condemning the soul to oblivion. This was not just a myth for entertainment. It was a spiritual reality Egyptians prepared for with obsessive devotion, ensuring every ritual, prayer, and charm was in place to tilt the scales towards salvation. To modern eyes, the idea of a soul devoured by a monster is chilling, yet for Egyptians it was the ultimate moral lesson: live in accordance with Maat or face annihilation. What stands out is that the darkness of these rituals lies not in cruelty, but in their intensity, their relentless focus on ensuring safe passage to the afterlife. Every funeral procession, every tomb painting, every uttered spell was an attempt to arm the dead with weapons against chaos. And while today these practices may seem macabre, They reveal a society that confronted mortality with unparalleled seriousness, turning fear into ritual and ritual into hope. By examining these funerary traditions closely, we separate the myth of sinister obsession from the reality of a people who, above all else, sought to conquer death through devotion, art, and ritual precision. While funerary practices may be the most famous, some of the darkest and most misunderstood rituals of ancient Egypt were tied not to death but to kingship, where the power of the pharaoh was both sacred and absolute, and rituals reinforced his role as a living god. From the moment of coronation, the king was not simply a political leader, but the earthly embodiment of Horus, chosen to maintain order and strike down chaos, a responsibility that demanded ceremonies filled with symbolic violence. One of the most striking examples is the ritual known as the smiting of enemies, an act often depicted on temple walls where the pharaoh is shown grasping a captive by the hair and raising a mace to strike. While these scenes may not always reflect actual executions, there is evidence that some ceremonies involve the ritualized killing of prisoners of war or criminals, acts designed to demonstrate the king's ability to destroy chaos itself. In the eyes of the Egyptians, these rituals were not cruelty but cosmic necessity, reinforcing the pharaoh's role as the defender of Maat. Another ritual tied to kingship was the Heb, said festival, a jubilee celebrated after 30 years of a ruler's reign. While the festival is often remembered for its pageantry, including the king running a symbolic circuit to demonstrate his continued strength, some scholars suggest that earlier versions may have contained darker undertones, possibly echoing myths where rulers who could not maintain order were ritually removed or replaced. Although there is no firm evidence that Egyptian pharaohs were killed in such ceremonies, the very possibility reflects how kingship was tied to divine approval. If a king could no longer embody cosmic order, he risked becoming a danger to his people. Even temple rituals tied to daily governance carried elements modern viewers might see as unsettling. Each morning, priests entered the sanctuary of the god's statue to awaken it, cleanse it, dress it, and offer it food, while reciting spells that banished enemies and sometimes invoked curses against rival nations. In these ceremonies, clay figurines representing foreigners or chaotic forces were bound, mutilated, and burned, symbolic acts meant to annihilate threats before they could manifest. To us, these images of binding and destruction might appear cruel, but to Egyptians they were acts of spiritual warfare, as real as any battle fought with swords and arrows. This blending of ritual and politics reached its peak in military campaigns, where pharaohs carried sacred standards and relied on priests to perform magical rites before battle, ensuring the gods marched with the army. Inscriptions describe how offerings were made, sacrifices performed, and incantations recited to weaken enemies, suggesting that victory was as much a product of ritual power as military strategy. Another lesser, known but powerful ritual tied to kingship was the foundation ceremony for temples, where the king physically cut the first furrow in the ground with a ceremonial plow and sometimes offered sacrifices, possibly including human ones in the earliest dynasties, to sanctify the site. Though such practices faded into symbolic acts over time, they highlight how Egyptian rulers believed divine favor could be secured only through rituals that bound blood, soil, and power together. Perhaps the darkest dimension of all was the idea that the pharaoh himself was subject to ritual judgment. Myths like the Osiris cycle, where the god is betrayed, murdered, and avenged, were constantly reenacted in ceremonies that reminded rulers of their precarious position. The king's divinity was not unconditional. It had to be proven through ritual acts of strength, justice, and sometimes even symbolic violence. For Egyptians, these practices created stability in a world of uncertainty, ensuring that their leader was more than human, a cosmic guardian whose rituals held chaos at bay. For us today, these same ceremonies appear as unsettling spectacles of domination, where religion and politics merged into an unbreakable bond of power. The reality is that Egyptian kingship was as much about ritual theater as governance, and these acts, however dark they seem, were the foundation of a civilization that endured for millennia. Among the practices that continue to capture the imagination of historians and the public alike are the rituals involving animals, which in ancient Egypt occupied a complex and often unsettling role in the religious landscape. To modern audiences, the idea of sacrificing animals or embalming them by the millions can appear dark and cruel, but for Egyptians these acts were expressions of devotion, ways of connecting to gods whose forms were often animalistic. Cats, ibises, crocodiles, rams, and falcons were not just animals but living manifestations of divine forces, and caring for them, or sacrificing them, was a sacred duty. In temples dedicated to gods like Bastet, the cat goddess, or Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, priests oversaw entire industries devoted to breeding animals for ritual purposes. Archaeologists have uncovered vast catacombs filled with mummified cats, ibises, and even crocodiles, carefully embalmed and placed in jars or coffins as offerings. To modern sensibilities, the mass killing of animals may appear shocking, but Egyptians saw each sacrifice as a direct prayer, a tangible way to win divine favor. In some cases, specific animals were elevated to divine status, treated as gods in their own right. The Apis bull, associated with Ptah and later Osiris, was kept in a lavish temple at Memphis, pampered with the finest food and honored in elaborate festivals. When the Apis bull died, it was buried in a sarcophagus fit for royalty, its funeral rivaling that of kings. Yet behind this reverence was also the belief that the animal's death had cosmic significance, marking the renewal of divine power on earth. The duality of worship and sacrifice is what makes Egyptian animal rituals feel so mysterious and unsettling today. Priests of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and plague, were known to conduct ceremonies in which animals were symbolically slaughtered to redirect her destructive rage, transforming chaos into protection for Egypt. To her devotees, such rites were acts of survival. To us, they echo the darker side of appeasing deities with blood. Crocodiles, feared and respected, were sacred to Sobek, the god of strength and fertility. In his temples, crocodiles were kept in pools, adorned with jewelry, and fed as divine beings. Yet at the same time, crocodiles were also mummified in staggering numbers and entombed as offerings, showing again the paradox of Egyptian religion. The animal could be both venerated and sacrificed. Falcons, sacred to Horus, were bred, killed, and embalmed in extraordinary quantities, each one intended as a miniature prayer for protection and victory. The scale of this industry is staggering. Excavations have revealed millions of animal mummies across Egypt, suggesting that these rituals were not occasional events, but ongoing acts of devotion that spanned centuries. What we see as dark mass killings, Egyptians saw as necessary repetition of sacred acts to maintain cosmic balance. Beyond sacrifice, animals also played roles in magical rituals. Certain spells required animal parts, bones, blood, or feathers, to give them potency, blurring the line between reverence and exploitation. While this might strike us as cruel, it reflected a world where animals were not separate from the divine but channels of it, vessels of energy that could be harnessed for protection or healing. These practices were not hidden from society but woven into the fabric of daily life. Markets existed where pilgrims could purchase votive animal mummies to dedicate at temples, much like lighting a candle in a church today. What appears to us as dark and sinister was, for Egyptians, a deeply personal way to reach out to their gods. Still, the sheer scale and intensity of animal sacrifice leave modern audiences unsettled, reminding us of the vast gulf between ancient beliefs and contemporary values. In peeling back these layers, we discover a society that lived in profound relationship with animals, seeing them as divine mediators, protectors, and sacrifices all at once. The myth of cruelty often overshadows the reality of devotion, yet the truth is that for Egyptians, every feather, paw, or claw carried cosmic weight in rituals designed to keep their world in harmony with the gods. Among the most fascinating yet eerie practices of ancient Egypt were the rituals of protection and cursing, ceremonies designed to shield individuals or the entire kingdom from harm, while at the same time unleashing devastating magical force against enemies. These practices reveal a civilization that believed words, symbols, and gestures could shape reality itself. A world, where magic, known as Heka, was not superstition but a divine energy given by the gods at the creation of the universe. To modern audiences, some of these rituals resemble scenes from a horror story, with clay figures smashed, names cursed, and blood or hair used in spells. Yet to the Egyptians, they were necessary tools for survival. One of the clearest examples comes from the so-called execration rituals, in which clay or wax figurines representing Egypt's enemies were inscribed with names, bound, mutilated, and then smashed or burned, often in temple courtyards. Archaeologists have found pits filled with broken figurines near fortresses and religious centers, evidence of these symbolic acts of destruction. For the Egyptians, destroying an enemy in effigy weakened their spirit and severed their connection to divine protection, effectively disarming them before battle. Such rituals may appear dark and vindictive, but they were powerful forms of psychological and spiritual warfare, reinforcing the belief that Egypt was safeguarded by both human armies and divine forces. Alongside curses came protective spells, often inscribed on papyrus, amulets, or even the walls of homes. Families would commission magical texts designed to keep away demons, sickness, or misfortune, invoking gods like Bes, the dwarf protector of households, or Isis, the mother goddess who defended children and mothers. Some of these spells called for unusual ingredients, nails from a coffin, the feather of a hawk, or drops of blood, giving them an aura of darkness in the modern imagination. Yet, for Egyptians, these items were not gruesome but potent, carrying symbolic power that tied the spell to the natural and supernatural worlds. Nighttime rituals were especially feared and revered. Priests and magicians would perform incantations in the dark, sometimes drawing protective circles with knives or chalk, chanting words designed to repel unseen threats. They believed the night was when malevolent forces were strongest, and thus when magic was most necessary. The Egyptians even believed that pharaohs themselves were at risk, and kings relied on elaborate protective ceremonies to ensure their safety. In some cases, ritual texts describe placing figurines of enemies under the throne, so the king literally sat on those who opposed him, symbolically crushing chaos beneath order. What makes these rituals both unsettling and compelling is their dual nature. They could heal or harm, protect or destroy, depending on intent. For example, the same spell that promised to shield a child from nightmares could, with different words, be used to curse a rival. Magic was not viewed as inherently good or evil. It was a neutral force, shaped by the will of the practitioner. This blurred line between prayer and curse is one reason Egyptian rituals feel so haunting to us today. They remind us of a society where fear and hope were bound together, where protection from evil required invoking its very image, and where the line between religion and sorcery was razor thin. And yet, far from being fringe practices, these rituals were mainstream, carried out in temples, homes, and even battlefields. They reveal a civilization that fought chaos with every weapon at its disposal, from the sword of the soldier to the spoken word of the priest. To us, the image of smashing figurines or chanting curses in the dead of night may feel like stepping into a world of dark superstition, but to Egyptians, these were acts of strength, demonstrations of control over a universe they believed was fragile and ever at risk of collapsing into disorder. Among the most haunting yet intriguing rituals of ancient Egypt were those connected to healing and the prevention of plague, ceremonies that often straddled the fine line between devotion and dread. Disease was one of the greatest fears of the ancient world, and Egyptians believed that illnesses were not merely physical afflictions, but manifestations of supernatural forces, sometimes caused by angry gods, restless spirits, or even curses cast by rivals. To fight this invisible enemy, priests and healers turned to elaborate rites that combined practical medicine with magical incantations, creating rituals that could appear both comforting and terrifying. One of the central figures in these practices was the goddess Sekhmet, a lion-headed deity known as both a bringer of plagues and a healer of wounds. Egyptians believed that when Sekhmet was angered, she unleashed devastating epidemics that could sweep through villages and armies alike, but if appeased through ritual, she could just as swiftly restore health. Priests dedicated to her performed daily ceremonies, reciting prayers, burning offerings, and wearing amulets shaped like lionesses to channel her protective side. In times of crisis, special rituals were enacted to cool Sekhmet's rage, including the pouring of red, colored liquids symbolizing blood, to trick the goddess into thinking she had already unleashed her fury. These vivid acts remind us that Egyptians lived in constant negotiation with their gods, seeking balance between wrath and mercy. Alongside such divine ceremonies, healing rituals often required unusual ingredients. Magical texts describe remedies involving honey, milk, natron, and herbs like cumin or coriander, combined with incantations chanted over the mixture. Yet other prescriptions call for stranger components: the ashes of specific animals, hair clippings, or even fragments of statues believed to hold divine essence. To us, these might sound bizarre or unsettling, but within the Egyptian world, each item carried symbolic power tied to the natural order. For example, honey symbolized life and renewal, while natron was both a cleanser and a sacred substance used in mummification, reinforcing the connection between purity and preservation. When epidemics struck, entire communities engaged in collective rituals, gathering to pray, chant, and sacrifice offerings to the gods in hopes of averting disaster. In some cases, priests carried statues of Sekhmet or other protective deities through the streets, believing that their presence could drive away evil spirits of disease. These ceremonies were both religious and psychological, giving people a sense of control in times when medicine alone was not enough. But healing rituals were not limited to the gods. Ordinary households practiced protective magic, hanging amulets shaped like the eye of Horus, the scarab beetle, or the dwarf god Bes, each thought to ward off sickness and evil. Parents recited chants over their children at night to shield them from nightmares and fevers, blending love with fear in rituals passed down for generations. The dual nature of these practices, combining compassion with an acknowledgement of divine wrath, gives them an almost Gothic quality today. They were rituals of care, but also of survival, conducted in a world where life could be snuffed out suddenly by forces beyond human control. Another fascinating aspect of healing rituals was the role of incantations that invoked not just gods but mythical events. Priests would recite stories of Horus being healed by Isis after being poisoned, drawing a parallel between the myth and the patient's suffering, as though reliving the divine story could transfer its power into reality. This storytelling as magic shows how deeply religion and health were intertwined, with myth serving not only as cultural memory but as active medicine. For modern viewers, the idea of fighting plagues with chants, red liquids, and mythic reenactments may seem more ritual theater than science, but for the Egyptians it was deadly serious, a way to enlist divine forces in a struggle for survival. These healing and plague rituals stand as some of the darkest yet most hopeful aspects of Egyptian magic, rooted in fear but aimed at preserving life. They reveal a society both terrified of and deeply connected to the unseen world, one that looked to gods like Sek, not just as destroyers but as indispensable protectors. In this paradox lies the enduring fascination of Egyptian ritual, the constant balance of light and darkness, mercy and wrath, health and death, all bound together in the drama of human survival. Beyond the embalming table and the iconic wrappings of linen, the funerary rituals of ancient Egypt unfolded as an elaborate drama intended to secure safe passage for the dead into the afterlife. And in these ceremonies we glimpse some of the darkest and most awe-inspiring practices of the ancient world. Death was not seen as an end, but as a perilous journey through a shadowy realm filled with trials, monsters, and divine judges, and every step had to be carefully prepared through ritual. One of the most important rites was the opening of the mouth ceremony, a dramatic act performed on the mummy or statue of the deceased to restore their ability to breathe, speak, and eat in the afterlife. Priests, dressed as Horus or Anubis, touched sacred tools to the lips of the corpse, reciting powerful invocations to awaken the senses of the dead. To the modern observer, this ritual may appear symbolic, but to the Egyptians it was the literal act of giving life to the departed, ensuring they were not trapped in eternal silence. Surrounding this central ceremony were countless protective spells drawn from the Book of the Dead, papyrus scrolls buried with the deceased, filled with incantations that served as a guidebook for the soul. These spells functioned like magical passwords, granting safe passage past demons and gatekeepers that prowled the underworld. Without them, the soul risked wandering lost forever. Some texts even describe specific dangers, lakes of fire, monstrous serpents, or giant devourers waiting to consume the unworthy. The Book of the Dead was not a single fixed text, but a collection tailored for each person, written by scribes and purchased at great cost by families who wanted to guarantee their loved ones' eternal survival. Alongside spells came the placement of amulets, carefully arranged within the wrappings of the mummy. The most famous of these was the scarab placed over the heart, inscribed with a spell to silence the conscience of the dead during judgment before Osiris. The Egyptians feared that a heart might betray its owner by speaking the truth of misdeeds, so the scarab served to protect the soul from condemnation, a chilling reminder of how much weight was placed on ritual preparation. Tombs themselves were infused with ritual magic. Walls were inscribed with hieroglyphs depicting offering scenes and protective spells, essentially transforming the chamber into a magical machine designed to feed and shield the dead. Statues of servants, known as shabtis, were buried by the dozens or even hundreds, enchanted to come alive in the afterlife and perform labor on behalf of the deceased, so that they could enjoy a life of leisure in the field of reeds. Yet, not all funerary rituals were benevolent. Some carried a darker edge, especially the so-called tomb curses. While Hollywood often exaggerates these, genuine Egyptian tomb inscriptions sometimes warned that violators would suffer blindness, drowning, or even the wrath of the gods if they dared disturb the resting place. These warnings may have been partly symbolic, but they also reveal the anxiety Egyptians felt about protecting their carefully constructed afterlife from the greed of the living. Funerary rituals also extended beyond the elite. Ordinary Egyptians, who could not afford lavish tombs or full copies of the Book of the Dead, relied on simplified ceremonies, modest amulets, or communal rituals performed by local priests. Still, even the poorest sought some kind of protection, reflecting the universal Egyptian fear of entering the afterlife unprepared. Rituals often blended grief with celebration. Families held feasts at tombs, offering food and drink to sustain their ancestors and maintain a bond across the veil of death. In this way, funerary practices served not only the dead but the living, reinforcing family ties and community identity through ritual acts of remembrance. For a modern audience, these funerary rituals highlight the intensity with which Egyptians approached death, transforming it from a biological event into a cosmic drama of survival. Each spell, amulet, and ceremony was part of a grand strategy to outwit oblivion, to turn death into a second birth in the eternal realm. And while some aspects, like heart, silencing scarabs or tomb curses, strike us as eerie or even sinister, they reveal a society that embraced both fear and hope in equal measure. Death was the great unknown, and through their rituals, the Egyptians sought to master it, ensuring that even in darkness, they could carve a path toward immortality. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration into the darkest rituals of ancient Egypt, we are left with a world that is both terrifying and profoundly human, a civilization that cloaked its deepest fears and highest hopes in ceremonies that often blur the line between myth and reality. To outsiders, these rituals, whether the summoning of gods through blood, red offerings, the fearsome rites of healing and plague prevention, or the elaborate ceremonies of the dead, might appear as superstition born of ignorance. Yet, when viewed through the eyes of the Egyptians themselves, they were anything but irrational. Each act was part of a logical system, one in which the cosmos was alive with forces that could bless or destroy, and ritual was the language through which humans negotiated with those forces. What strikes us most today is the dual nature of these practices, at once rooted in compassion, like the chants of a parent over a sick child, and shadowed by dread, like the curses inscribed on tomb walls to ward off intruders. The myths that wrapped themselves around these rituals added yet another layer, ensuring that every action connected the present to a divine narrative. When priests reenacted the poisoning and healing of Horus, they were not just performing a symbolic play, but drawing on a cosmic precedent, aligning the fate of an ordinary patient with the story of the gods. Similarly, funerary rites were not just about embalming a body, but about staging a divine drama in which every word, every gesture, every amulet carried the weight of eternity. Myths gave these rituals power, while rituals gave the myths life, creating a cycle that bound religion, medicine, law, and daily life into one seamless tapestry. But we must also recognize the darker reality behind these acts. For all their grandeur, they reveal a people living in constant anxiety, of disease, of famine, of betrayal, of death. Rituals gave order to chaos, but they also reflected the fragility of existence in a harsh environment where the Nile could bring both prosperity and disaster. In this sense, Egypt's darkest rituals were not mere curiosities of the ancient past, but universal expressions of the human condition, the struggle to find meaning, safety, and continuity in a world that often feels hostile and unpredictable. For modern audiences in the United States and beyond, these rituals remind us of how deeply intertwined belief and survival once were, and how rituals we might dismiss as strange were once the pillars of social and personal security. And while archaeology and science have stripped away much of the mystery, uncovering the tools, texts, and techniques behind these practices, something elusive remains. Standing in the shadow of a temple or peering into a tomb, we can almost hear the whispered prayers, smell the incense curling through the air, and feel the weight of a civilization speaking to its gods. Whether we call them myths or realities, the rituals of ancient Egypt endure because they touch on questions that remain timeless. How do we confront death? How do we face disease and disaster? How do we honor the past and secure the future? The Egyptians answered with ceremonies both magnificent and macabre, embedding their fears and hopes in acts that still captivate us thousands of years later. In the end, their darkest rituals are not just relics of a vanished civilization. They are mirrors, reflecting back our own enduring search for meaning in the face of the unknown.